Hello and welcome to The Quiet Historian. Imagine a city built on a muddy island in a river. No natural harbour and no protective mountains. No gold mines and no great army, standing exposed on a floodplain in the heart of hostile territory. By all logic, this city should have remained a provincial outpost, forgotten by the great powers of its age. And yet, for 2,000 years, this impossible place has been the intellectual capital of the Western world. This is the story of Paris. So, how did they do it? How did a river crossing become the birthplace of revolution? How did a city with no natural advantages create an empire not of territory, but of ideas? Tonight, we will tell the epic story of Paris from the Parisi to the present. We will walk through the birth of the first universities. We will stand in the salons where the Enlightenment ignited. We will hear the roar of revolution in the streets. We will see how ideas proved more powerful than any army ever raised. This is a story of incredible audacity and artistic brilliance. It is also the story of a city that paid in blood for every idea it gave the world, of a place that was conquered again and again, yet rose each time to conquer through thought. But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of limestone and torchlight, of cobblestone streets and philosophical debates, of quiet cafés where the future was imagined. The story of Paris begins not with grandeur, but with a desperate flight. In the 3rd century BC, a Celtic tribe known as the Parisi lived along the banks of a great river in northern Gaul. The river flowed slow and dark through thick forests. The Romans would later call it the Sequana. We know it as the Seine. The Parisiais were practical people, traders and fishermen. They moved goods between the northern tribes and the Mediterranean world, far to the south. In the middle of the river, there was a small island. It was barely half a mile long, narrow and marshy, prone to flooding when winter rains swelled the river. It was not an impressive piece of land, but it offered one singular virtue: control. The island commanded the most important river crossing in all of northern Gaul. Whoever held that crossing controlled the flow of trade. The waters of the Seine created a natural moat on all sides. Any approaching enemy would have to cross the river, giving the islanders precious time to prepare. The Parisi built their settlement on that unpromising strip of mud and reeds. They drove wooden stakes deep into the riverbed until they hit harder clay below. On top of these stakes they laid platforms of timber. On the platforms they built their homes, simple structures of wood and thatch, raised above the floodwaters. Their new community was based not on the soil of the earth, but on the current of the water. But how do you defend a settlement built on mud? The Parisiais developed an ingenious solution. They constructed wooden bridges connecting the island to both banks, bridges designed to be cut down if danger approached. They stockpiled weapons and food on the high ground in the centre of the island. They trained young men to fight from boats, turning the river itself into a weapon. This unique and challenging environment forged a particular kind of people. Their roads were the river, their walls were the current, their lives became oriented entirely towards flow and position. This daily struggle with the water taught them pragmatism and strategic thinking. The settlement that was born from commercial necessity was not destined to remain a tribal trading post. It was poised to use its strategic position to become a power in its own right. But first it would face its greatest test. In the year 52 BC, the most powerful military force the world had ever seen arrived in Gaul. Julius Caesar was in the midst of his brutal conquest of the region. Tribe after tribe had fallen before the unstoppable Roman legions. The Parisiais knew they could not defeat Rome in open battle. They were merchants and fishermen, not warriors trained for war. And so they faced a terrible choice. The tribal council gathered on the island to decide their fate. Scouts had brought news. The Roman legions were 3 days' march to the south. Smoke rose from villages downriver where the Romans had already passed. Some villages had surrendered. Others had resisted and were now burning ruins. A young warrior stood to speak. He had seen the Roman army with his own eyes. He proposed surrender. Perhaps, he argued, Rome would be merciful to a people who submitted without a fight. An old woman laughed, a bitter sound in the council hall. She had lived long enough to know what Rome did to tribes that surrendered. Taxes that crushed. Sons conscripted into distant wars. Daughters taken. The slow death of everything they were. The elder who led the council stood. He spoke quietly, but every person listened. "The Romans want this crossing," he said. "They will have it. We cannot stop them, but we can choose what they find when they arrive." He paused. "If we surrender, they will occupy our homes. They will use our bridges. Our settlement will become a Roman garrison. Our children will grow up speaking Latin, serving Roman masters." He took a breath. "But if we deny them our shelter, if we leave them nothing but empty land, then they will have to build everything themselves. They will still take the crossing, but they will not take us." He looked around at his people. "If we cannot have our home, then Caesar shall have only ashes." The vote was taken. The decision was nearly unanimous. That night, they did what had to be done. Families took torches to their own homes. A mother wept as she set fire to the house where her children had been born. A craftsman watched as his workshop burned, 3 generations of tools consumed by flames. They cut the bridges with axes, the heavy timbers falling into the black water. They loaded what they could carry into small boats and made their way north, following tributaries that only they knew. They left nothing for Rome but smoking ruins and an empty strategic position. When Caesar's legions arrived, they found an island of ash. No food, no shelter, no bridges, no people, just the river crossing itself. But Caesar understood immediately what the Parisi had known all along. This crossing was worth more than any village. It was the key to controlling northern Gaul. Within a few years, Roman engineers began to rebuild. They did not build on the island at first. The marshy ground proved difficult. Instead, the Romans built on the left bank of the river, on higher ground less prone to flooding. They called their new settlement Lutetia, from the Latin word for mud or swamp. The name was a description, not a compliment. A town built on mud, in a waterlogged frontier, far from the warmth and civilization of Rome. But Rome brought something to this muddy frontier that would change everything. They brought their genius for engineering. They built a magnificent aqueduct system that brought fresh water from springs 15 miles away. The water flowed through stone channels, across valleys on soaring arches, into the heart of the growing town. They constructed public baths where citizens could gather and conduct business while soaking in hot water. They built an amphitheatre that could seat 15,000 people for gladiatorial games. They paved roads using the Roman method of layers, stones fitted so precisely that water drained between them. These roads connected Lutetia to the vast network of Roman highways that spanned the empire. For the first time, this remote river crossing was linked to Rome itself, to the markets of Gaul and Spain, to the legions stationed along the Rhine. Latin became the language of commerce and government. Roman law replaced tribal custom. But beneath the veneer of Roman civilization, the old culture persisted. The native people spoke Latin in the forum, but kept their own Celtic tongue at home. They worshipped Roman gods in public temples, but made offerings to their old deities in secret groves. This dual identity, this ability to absorb outside influence while maintaining a distinct character, would shape the city for millennia to come. To protect the growing town from barbarian raids, the Romans built massive stone walls around the Ile de la Cité. These fortifications were 20 feet high, reinforced with towers. The island became a fortress rising from the Seine, but walls alone could not hold back the tide of history. By the 4th century AD, the Western Roman Empire was crumbling. The Rhine frontier was collapsing. Barbarian tribes were pushing west in waves. Roman legions were being defeated. The imperial government was fragmenting. The provinces were increasingly left to defend themselves. In the 5th century, wave after wave of invaders swept through Gaul. The Huns came from the east, the Visigoths from the south, the Burgundians from the Rhine, and finally the Franks, a Germanic people who would change everything. In 486, a Frankish king named Clovis defeated the last Roman governor of Gaul. He chose Lutetia as the capital of his new kingdom. This was a turning point. For the first time, the city was the centre of real power, not just a provincial outpost. Clovis was shrewd and ruthless. He understood that to control his fractious warriors and the conquered Roman population, he needed more than military might. He needed the support of the church. The old Roman population was Christian. The Frankish warriors worshipped Germanic gods. In 496, Clovis made a calculated decision. He converted to Catholic Christianity. According to legend, he did so on the battlefield, vowing that if he won the fight, he would convert. He won. He kept his vow. This single act transformed the political landscape of Europe. The Frankish kingdom became the defender of Catholic Christianity in the West. The Pope looked to the Franks as his protectors. Clovis built churches across his realm to cement this alliance. In Lutetia, he founded the great abbey of Sainte Geneviève on the left bank. This abbey was dedicated to the patron saint of the city. Geneviève was said to have saved Lutetia from Attila the Hun through her prayers. When Attila's army approached, the people panicked and prepared to flee. Geneviève convinced them to stay and pray instead. Miraculously, Attila's army turned away. Whether this was divine intervention or military strategy, the people believed. Geneviève became the city's protector. Her cult became central to its identity. Under Frankish rule, the old Roman name of Lutetia began to fade. The Franks increasingly called the city Paris, a name derived from the original Parisi tribe. It was a return to its roots. Paris grew slowly through the early Middle Ages. It was still a small medieval town, clustered around the fortified island. The streets were narrow and muddy. Most buildings were wooden. Fires were common. Disease spread quickly. Life was short and brutal for most inhabitants. Yet the seeds of something greater were being planted. The Frankish kings built palaces on the island. The church built monasteries on both banks. Merchants established guilds. Stone slowly replaced wood. But in the 9th century, a new threat appeared that would test Paris as never before. The Vikings had discovered that their longships could navigate the Seine deep into Francia. In 845, a fleet of dragon-prowed ships sailed up the river. Viking raiders had found Paris. The city was not prepared. The walls of the Ile de la Cité held, but the settlements on the riverbanks were burned and looted. Churches were stripped of treasures. The survivors paid a massive ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver to make the Vikings leave. But the Norsemen had learned something valuable. Paris was rich. They returned again and again. Each raid brought death and destruction. The Frankish kings seemed powerless. The population abandoned the suburbs and crowded onto the island. The great churches on the left bank were abandoned. Paris was being slowly strangled. Then in the winter of 885, the Vikings launched their most ambitious attack yet. A fleet of 700 ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors sailed up the Seine. They laid siege to Paris itself. This time, Paris did not fall. The defenders, led by Count Odo, held the walls through months of brutal siege. The Vikings built siege towers. They were repelled. Disease swept through both camps. Starvation threatened the defenders, but they held. When the siege finally ended after nearly a year, Paris had survived. The Vikings withdrew after being paid tribute by the Frankish king, but the city had proven something crucial. It could not be easily conquered. Count Odo became a hero. His defense made him so popular that he was eventually elected king of the Franks. The siege had another lasting effect. It demonstrated that Paris was the key to controlling the kingdom. Whoever held Paris held Francia. Over the next 2 centuries, the French monarchy slowly consolidated its power. Paris, as the royal capital, grew in wealth and importance. By the 12th century, the city was entering a golden age. But this was not a golden age of military conquest. Paris was about to make a choice that would define its destiny forever. Not a military choice, not a political choice, but an intellectual one. The population was exploding. The little island could no longer contain the expanding city. New settlements sprawled onto both riverbanks. On the right bank, merchants built houses and warehouses. Markets flourished. Guilds grew powerful. On the right bank, commerce ruled. But on the left bank, something different was happening. Monasteries were opening schools, not just for priests, but for anyone who wanted to learn. Young men arrived from across Europe, hungry for knowledge. They came from England, from Italy, from the German lands. They slept in cheap rooms. They attended lectures. They argued late into the night about theology and philosophy. These schools would eventually merge into something revolutionary. The University of Paris, the Sorbonne, one of the first true universities in human history. It was not just a place where knowledge was preserved. It was a place where new ideas were born, where young minds questioned everything, where accepted wisdom could be challenged. From its new universities, Paris began to export something more powerful than any trade good: knowledge itself, ideas about theology, philosophy, law. Students who studied in Paris returned to their homelands as teachers, judges, and advisors to kings. The ideas debated on the left bank were spreading across Europe, quietly reshaping how people thought. But ideas need more than universities. They need physical homes worthy of the divine. And Paris was about to build the most magnificent home for God that Europe had ever seen. The construction of Notre Dame began in 1163 under Bishop Maurice de Sully. He envisioned a church so magnificent it would glorify God and proclaim the power of Paris to the world. It would take nearly 200 years to complete. Generations of craftsmen laboured on its construction. Stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, sculptors. They pioneered revolutionary building techniques. The Gothic style used pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. These innovations allowed the walls to soar to unprecedented heights. The stone seemed to defy gravity. Inside, light streamed through vast stained glass windows, transforming the interior into a kaleidoscope of colour. The rose windows were particularly magnificent, depicting biblical scenes in brilliant reds, blues, and golds. Walk the streets of medieval Paris in your mind. The morning air is thick with the smell of baking bread from the boulangeries on every corner. Church bells echo across the narrow streets. The Seine flows dark and sluggish, reflecting the white limestone of the cathedral. On the left bank, young scholars debate in Latin outside the colleges. Their voices rise and fall. On the right bank, merchants call out their wares. The smell of fish from the morning catch mixes with the sharp scent of tanning leather. Waste runs in the gutters. The streets are muddy, but above it all rises Notre Dame, its towers climbing toward heaven, its bells singing over the city. Notre Dame was more than a church, it was a statement, the physical manifestation of medieval Paris's confidence. The soaring towers announced to the world that this city was no longer a provincial outpost, it was a rival to Rome itself. Paris was becoming something no army could conquer, a city of minds. But ideas need protection. And in the 13th century, Paris faced a threat that would test whether ideas could survive the sword. England and France were locked in a bitter rivalry. The English kings claimed vast territories in France. The French kings sought to expel them. What followed was the 100 Years' War, a conflict that would devastate France for over a century. Paris, as the capital, was both the prize and the stronghold. In 1420, after the catastrophic French defeat at Agincourt, the English occupied Paris. They ruled through French collaborators. The true French king was forced to flee south. For 16 years, Paris was an English city. French was banned in official documents. The university was censored. English governors ruled from the palace. It seemed possible that Paris would forever be lost, that the French language might disappear from its own capital. But the tide turned in an unexpected way. In 1429, a peasant girl from Lorraine arrived at the exiled king's court. Her name was Joan of Arc. She claimed voices from heaven had told her to drive the English out of France. Against all logic, the king gave her an army. She led French forces to victory at Orléans. She fought in armour alongside the soldiers. She was wounded but kept fighting. Her courage inspired the French to continue when all seemed lost. Though Joan was captured and burned at the stake in 1431, her actions had changed everything. By 1436, Paris was back in French hands. The English were gradually expelled from all of France. The 100 Years' War left France exhausted but united. The monarchy emerged stronger than ever. Paris, as the capital of this newly powerful state, entered a period of renewed growth. But it had learned something important. The English had superior armies for decades, but still lost France. Why? Because the French people refused to accept English rule. Because the idea of France, the idea of a distinct culture and language centred in Paris, was stronger than any army. Ideas had proven their power. In the late 15th century, the Renaissance arrived in France. French kings, dazzled by the art and culture of Italy, brought Italian artists and scholars to their court. Leonardo da Vinci spent his final years in France, dying in the arms of King Francis I. The Renaissance transformed Paris. The old medieval fortress city began to give way to a more elegant style. The Louvre, originally a medieval fortress, was remodeled into a Renaissance palace. But the Renaissance in France was interrupted by a catastrophic religious conflict. In the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation swept across Europe. In France, the Protestant movement known as the Huguenots gained many followers. The Catholic monarchy saw this as a threat to both religious unity and royal authority. The result was decades of brutal civil war. Paris became the centre of Catholic resistance. The city's population was fiercely Catholic. They saw the Protestants as heretics. On the night of August 23rd, 1572, Catholic mobs, encouraged by the royal family, went on a killing spree. It was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. They murdered thousands of Huguenots in Paris and across France. The streets ran with blood. Bodies were thrown into the Seine by the cartload. The river carried corpses downstream for days. The massacre shocked Europe. The violence continued for decades. Paris was besieged, starved, and nearly destroyed. But eventually, a solution emerged. A Huguenot prince named Henry of Navarre fought his way to the throne. To secure his kingdom, he made a pragmatic choice. He converted to Catholicism, famously declaring that Paris is worth a mass. It was a statement of cold political calculation. The city mattered more than personal conviction. In 1594, he entered Paris as King Henry IV. He brought peace. Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, which granted limited religious tolerance to the Huguenots. He also understood that a great king needed a great capital. He invested heavily in the beautification of Paris. He built new bridges connecting the islands to the banks. He constructed the Place des Vosges, a perfectly symmetrical square of red brick and stone arcades. It became a model for urban planning across Europe. His reign marked the beginning of Paris's transformation into the elegant city we recognise today. But Henry's vision was cut short. In 1610, he was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic. His young son inherited the throne. For the next decades, France was governed by Cardinal Richelieu, who served as chief minister. Richelieu had a simple but audacious goal. He wanted to make France the dominant power in Europe. He wanted to centralise all power in the hands of the king. Paris was the centre of this project. When Louis XIII died in 1643, his 5-year-old son became King Louis XII. For nearly 2 decades, France was governed by another cardinal, Mazarin. The young Louis grew up watching these ministers wield absolute power. He also witnessed a traumatic civil war known as the Fronde, in which the nobles of Paris rebelled. The young king had to flee the city. He never forgot the humiliation. When Louis XIV finally took control in 1661, he was determined that no one would ever challenge him again. He famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. He was the Sun King, the absolute monarch around whom all of France revolved. Picture the young king returning to Paris after the Fronde. He had been forced to flee his own capital as a child. Now, with absolute power in his hands, he would ensure it never happened again. His solution was audacious. He would move the court to Versailles. By removing the nobility from Paris, he could keep them under his direct supervision in a glittering prison of etiquette. At Versailles, the king's daily routine became an elaborate ceremony. Nobles competed for the honour of holding the king's shirt. Every gesture was laden with meaning. This was power as theatre, and Louis was the star. But while the court moved to Versailles, Paris remained the economic and cultural heart of the kingdom. Louis XIV understood what the Parisi had known. Whoever controls Paris controls not just territory, but the very idea of civilization. He undertook massive building projects in the capital. He constructed the Hôtel des Invalides as a hospital for wounded soldiers. Its golden dome became one of the most recognizable landmarks in the city. He built the Place Vendôme, a grand square of perfect symmetry. He commissioned triumphal arches. But more importantly, he established royal academies to control and promote French culture. The Académie Française regulated the French language. The Academy of Sciences promoted research. France, and Paris in particular, became the arbiter of taste for all of Europe. The French language became the language of diplomacy. French architecture, French cuisine, French manners were imitated everywhere. To speak French was to claim sophistication. But this cultural dominance came at a terrible cost. Louis XIV's endless wars drained the treasury. The burden fell most heavily on peasants and the common people of Paris, who paid taxes on everything. The king and nobility were exempt from most taxes. The inequity bred resentment. By the time Louis XIV died in 1715, after ruling for 72 years, France was exhausted and deeply in debt. The splendour of Versailles had been built on the backs of people who could barely afford bread. In the streets of Paris, in the cafés far from the king's glittering court, a dangerous question was beginning to be whispered. Does it have to be this way? Could society be organised differently? More fairly? More rationally? The philosophers who would dare to answer these questions were about to set the world on fire. The 18th century was the age of Enlightenment, and Paris was its capital. In elegant salons hosted by wealthy women, the greatest minds of Europe gathered. These were not formal academic settings. They were private gatherings where philosophers, writers, scientists, and artists mixed with nobles. The most famous of these thinkers were Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and Montesquieu. They questioned everything. They challenged the authority of the church, they critiqued the monarchy, they argued for reason over tradition, individual liberty over inherited privilege. Their ideas were revolutionary, and they knew it. Voltaire, the most famous of them all, spent nearly a year in the Bastille for writing satirical verses. When he was released, he was imprisoned again. The second time, he was offered a choice: permanent imprisonment or exile to England. He chose England, where he discovered the ideas of John Locke and Isaac Newton. He returned to France more dangerous than ever, armed with English concepts of liberty. His books were banned. He was forced to live outside Paris, but his ideas circulated in secret, copied by hand, passed from salon to salon. Meanwhile, Diderot and other scholars were compiling the Encyclopédie, a massive work that attempted to catalogue all human knowledge. Imagine trying to write down everything humanity knew, every scientific discovery, every philosophical argument, every technical process from making paper to casting cannon. It would take decades and thousands of pages, 28 volumes in the end, and it would terrify the church and crown. The encyclopédie included articles on gunpowder, on political theory. It included engravings showing how craftsmen worked, revealing trade secrets jealously guarded by guilds. The Catholic Church banned it. The royal government censored it. Diderot himself was imprisoned for 3 months. But the work continued in secret. It was printed and distributed anyway, smuggled across France and Europe in crates and carts. The philosophers gathered in the cafés of Paris. The Café Procope, opened in 1686, became a legendary meeting place. Here, over coffee that had recently arrived from the New World, over wine from the countryside, the future of France was debated. Voltaire had his own table where he held court. Diderot argued with anyone who would listen. Young writers came to be seen. The old certainties of monarchy and church were crumbling under the weight of rational argument. New ideas about democracy, natural rights, and social equality were taking root. The idea that government should serve the people. The idea that all men are born free and equal. The idea that knowledge, not breeding, should determine worth. These ideas remained largely confined to the educated elite, but they were spreading, and they were about to explode into the streets. By the late 18th century, Paris was a city of stark contrasts. It had a population of over 600,000. But the growth had been chaotic. The poor lived in cramped tenements, 5 or 6 stories high, their windows facing courtyards that never saw sunlight. Disease was rampant. 1 child in 4 died before their first birthday. The streets were filled with beggars, pickpockets, and prostitutes. The wealthy lived in stone townhouses with wrought iron balconies, their high-ceilinged rooms filled with gilded furniture and crystal chandeliers. They attended the opera in silk and jewels. The contrast was visible every day. A nobleman's carriage would splash through the gutters, spattering the workers who had to step aside. The royal government seemed incapable of addressing the crisis. King Louis XIV, who came to the throne in 1774, was well-meaning but weak. He wanted to reform the tax system, but every reform was blocked by privileged classes who refused to give up their exemptions. Meanwhile, France had bankrupted itself, supporting the American Revolution. The cost had been enormous. By the late 1780s, the government was on the verge of collapse. The treasury was empty, bread prices were soaring, the harvest of 1788 had failed, leading to food shortages. The king was forced to call a meeting of the Estates General, a medieval assembly that had not met in over a century. Representatives from across France gathered at Versailles in May 1789. The Estates General was divided into 3 orders. The first estate represented the clergy, the second estate represented the nobility, the third estate represented everyone else, from wealthy bankers to poor peasants. The third estate demanded real power. They were tired of being ignored, of paying all the taxes while the nobility and clergy paid nothing. On June 20th, 1789, when they were locked out of their meeting hall, the representatives gathered in a tennis court at Versailles. They took an oath not to disband until they had written a new constitution for France. The tennis court oath was a revolutionary act. It challenged the absolute authority of the king. It declared that sovereignty resided in the people. The revolution had begun. The news from Versailles reached Paris on dusty boots and sweating horses. The third estate had defied the king. Revolution. Paris exploded. The streets filled with people. In the cafés, the talk was of nothing else. Bread prices had tripled. There were rumours the king was massing troops around the city. On July 14th, a crowd gathered outside the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison in the heart of Paris. They demanded weapons to defend themselves. The fortress commander refused. Someone fired a shot. No one knows who. Then everything happened at once. The crowd surged forward. They dragged cannons through the streets. They stormed the gates. The garrison fired down into the mob. Bodies fell on the cobblestones. Blood pooled in the gutters. But the crowd pressed on, unstoppable now, driven by rage and fear and hope. By evening, the Bastille had fallen. The crowd paraded the commander's head through the streets on a pike. They found only 7 prisoners inside. The fortress was mostly empty. But that didn't matter. The symbol was everything. The Bastille represented tyranny made stone, and stone can be broken. When Louis XVI heard the news at Versailles, he asked, "Is it a revolt?" "No, sire," answered the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt. "It is a revolution." The old world was over. The new world was being born, bloody and screaming, in the streets of Paris. The revolution quickly radicalized. The king and queen were brought from Versailles to Paris as virtual prisoners. The National Assembly abolished feudalism. They issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaiming liberty, equality, and fraternity. These were the ideas born in Paris cafés, now becoming law. But revolutions devour their own children. Moderates were replaced by radicals. The radicals were replaced by fanatics. The king, suspected of plotting with foreign powers, was tried for treason. On a cold January morning in 1793, King Louis XVI climbed the steps of the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. He tried to speak to the crowd, to proclaim his innocence, but the drums drowned out his voice. The blade fell. The crowd surged forward, some dipping handkerchiefs in the royal blood. The 1,000-year-old French monarchy died in that moment. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette made the same journey. She was only 37, but looked ancient. Her hair turned completely white from stress. As she was led through the streets in an open cart, crowds jeered. But she maintained her dignity, her head held high. On the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last words were an apology. "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Even in death, she was still a queen. The reign of terror began. The revolutionary government, led by Robespierre, unleashed a wave of executions. Anyone suspected of being an enemy of the revolution was arrested, given a hasty trial, and sent to the guillotine. Thousands died in Paris alone. Aristocrats, priests, moderate revolutionaries, ordinary people, denounced by neighbours. Paris in 1793 smelled of gunpowder and fear. The cobblestones were stained dark. The gutters ran red after the daily executions. In the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine stood like a dark prophet, its blade rising and falling. Day after day, the carts carried the condemned. Some went to their deaths with courage, some with defiance, some with prayers on their lips. But walk away from the killing grounds, and Paris was still Paris. The Seine still flowed. The morning light still turned the limestone buildings gold. The cafés still served coffee, though now the conversations were about liberty and equality instead of fashion and art. The terror could not last. The guillotine claimed Robespierre himself in July 1794. He was arrested by his fellow revolutionaries and executed the next day. The revolution entered a new phase, but France was exhausted by years of upheaval. The country desperately needed stability. It needed a strong leader. That leader emerged from the battlefields. A young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte had won stunning victories in Italy and Egypt. He was short, intense, and brilliant. His soldiers worshipped him. He understood something the corrupt government did not. After a decade of revolution and terror, the French people wanted order. In November 1799, Napoleon staged a coup. He dissolved the government at gunpoint. He declared himself first consul. The revolution, which had begun with declarations of liberty, was ending with a military dictatorship. But Napoleon was a dictator who understood theatre. He held votes to ratify his power. The people chose overwhelmingly yes. They chose order over chaos, strength over freedom. Napoleon brought both. He stabilized the currency. He reformed the legal system with his Code Napoleon, enshrining equality before the law and meritocracy while ending liberty of the press. It was revolutionary in form, but authoritarian in spirit, and it worked. France began to prosper. But Napoleon was not content to be first consul. In 1804, he took the next step. In a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, with Pope Pius VII in attendance, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. The cathedral was filled with dignitaries. The walls were hung with tapestries. Incense filled the air. The Pope was there to give his blessing. But when the moment came to place the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon took it from the Pope's hands and crowned himself. Then he took a second crown and placed it on his wife Josephine's head. The symbolism was unmistakable. Napoleon answered to no one. The revolution had come full circle. France, which had beheaded a king, now had an emperor. But Napoleon was not like the old kings. He promoted men based on talent. His marshals were sons of innkeepers and barrel makers. He opened careers to anyone with ability. And what an empire he would build. Napoleon launched a series of wars that would engulf Europe for over a decade. His military genius was undeniable. At Austerlitz in 1805, he destroyed a combined Russian and Austrian army. At Jena in 1806, he shattered the Prussian army in a single afternoon. At Wagram in 1809, he defeated the Austrians after a battle that left 40,000 men dead. His armies marched from Madrid to Moscow. At its height, the Napoleonic Empire controlled most of Western Europe. Only Britain, protected by the Channel and the Royal Navy, remained beyond his grasp. Paris was the capital of this vast empire. Napoleon transformed it. He built monuments to celebrate his victories. The Arc de Triomphe, begun in 1806, was designed to honour his soldiers. He commissioned the column in the Place Vendôme, topped with a statue of himself in Roman dress. He improved infrastructure, building new bridges, sewers, markets. He established elite schools to train engineers. His Code Napoleon became the legal foundation of dozens of countries. His vision was to make Paris the capital of a new European order. But empires built on conquest are fragile. They depend on constant victory. In 1812, Napoleon made the decision that would destroy everything. He decided to invade Russia. The Russian Tsar had broken his alliance with France. Napoleon would punish him. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men. They marched east in the summer of 1812. The Russian army retreated before them, burning everything. Napoleon pursued, expecting battle. He got one at Borodino outside Moscow. It was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. 70,000 men fell dead or wounded in 12 hours. The Russians retreated again. Napoleon marched into Moscow in September, expecting surrender. Instead, the city burned. Napoleon waited in the smoking ruins for 5 weeks. The Tsar never came. Finally, with winter approaching, Napoleon retreated. It became a nightmare. The Russian winter came early and brutal. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero. The soldiers froze to death by the thousands. Russian cavalry harassed the retreat. Cossacks picked off stragglers. The Grande Armée dissolved into a starving mob. Of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. Napoleon abandoned his army and raced back to Paris, but the spell was broken. In 1813, a coalition invaded France. Napoleon fought brilliantly, but he was outnumbered. In March 1814, Paris fell to Russian and Prussian troops. Napoleon was forced to abdicate. His wife and son were taken to Austria. He was exiled to Elba, a tiny island off Italy. The Bourbon monarchy was restored. But Napoleon was watching from Elba. He saw that the restored Bourbons were making mistakes. In February 1815, he escaped with 1,000 loyal soldiers and landed in southern France. The king sent troops to arrest him. When Napoleon confronted them, he opened his coat and said, "Soldiers, if there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers threw down their weapons and joined him. Regiment after regiment defected. The king fled. Napoleon entered Paris in triumph without firing a shot. For 100 days he ruled France again. But Europe would not allow it. The coalition assembled another massive army. Napoleon marched north to meet them in Belgium. On June 18, 1815, the armies met at Waterloo. It was close. Napoleon nearly won, but when the Prussians arrived late in the day, the French army broke. Napoleon fled the field. This time, there would be no mercy. He was exiled to St. Helena, a remote volcanic island in the South Atlantic. There he would spend his final 6 years, dictating his memoirs. He died in 1821, probably of stomach cancer. He was 51. His body was brought back to Paris in 1840 and entombed beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, where it remains today. The monarchy was restored after Waterloo, but the ideas unleashed in Paris could not be suppressed. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the rights of man. These ideas had spread across Europe and the Americas. Paris could not stop revolving. In July 1830, King Charles VI issued decrees that dissolved Parliament and restricted voting rights. Paris exploded. Barricades went up overnight. For 3 days, the Trois Glorieuses, the city was a battlefield. When it was over, Charles VI had fled, but the outcome was a disappointment. Instead of a republic, France got another king, Louis Philippe, the citizen king who wore a business suit and carried an umbrella. But he still governed for the wealthy. 18 years later, in February 1848, Paris rose again. This time the barricades returned. The National Guard joined the uprising. Louis Philippe abdicated and fled. This time, Paris proclaimed a republic. The Second Republic. Universal male suffrage was declared, but the conservative countryside feared the radical city. In the presidential election, they chose Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great emperor. 4 years later, Louis Napoleon staged a coup and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. Paris had learned to overthrow kings, but not yet how to govern itself. The barricades had become the city's signature gesture, a symbol of its refusal to accept tyranny, but also of its instability. Napoleon III ruled France for nearly 2 decades, but his greatest legacy was not political. It was physical. He entrusted the transformation of Paris to Baron Haussmann, a visionary urban planner with an iron will. Haussmann's mission was to remake Paris into a modern city. The old medieval Paris of narrow winding streets was unsanitary, overcrowded, and perfect for revolutionaries to build barricades. Haussmann would change all that. Beginning in the 1850s, he tore down entire neighbourhoods without mercy. He demolished tens of thousands of old buildings. He evicted hundreds of thousands of poor residents from the centre. The human cost was staggering. Families who had lived in the same neighbourhoods for generations were scattered to the outskirts. In their place, Haussmann constructed wide, straight boulevards lined with 6-story apartment buildings of uniform cream-coloured limestone. Each building had the same height, the same iron balconies on the 2nd and 5th floors, the same slate mansard roofs with dormer windows. These boulevards were designed for beauty, with their regular facades and tree-lined sidewalks, but they were also designed for control. Wide streets made it impossible to build barricades. They allowed cavalry to move quickly to suppress unrest. Haussmann built parks, squares, grand public buildings. He modernized the water supply and sewage systems. He planted over 100,000 trees along the boulevards. The result was the Paris we know, the city of wide avenues and grand vistas, of elegant apartment buildings and sidewalk cafés. It was a stunning achievement, copied by cities around the world, but it came at a terrible cost. The poor were driven to the periphery, to squalid slums that ringed the beautiful centre. The city became more segregated by class than ever before. Napoleon III's foreign adventures were less successful. He involved France in a series of wars and colonial ventures, but his greatest mistake was provoking a war with Prussia in 1870. The Franco-Prussian War was a disaster. The Prussian army was better trained and equipped. In a series of rapid victories, the Prussians invaded France and surrounded Paris. Napoleon III was captured. The Second Empire collapsed. A new government, the Third Republic, was proclaimed in Paris. But the Prussians laid siege to the city. For 4 months, Paris was cut off from the world. No food entered, no one could leave. The restaurants of the boulevards closed one by one. The bread lines grew longer each day. Then the bakeries ran out of flour entirely. Parisians ate the horses first. The magnificent animals that had pulled carriages were led to the slaughterhouse. When the horses were gone, they ate the dogs. The beloved pets ended up in cooking pots. People ate cats, rats, even the animals from the zoo. The elephants, castor and pollux, favourites of Parisian children, were killed and butchered. In the Luxembourg gardens, beautiful trees that had stood for a century were cut down for firewood. Wealthy families burned their furniture to stay warm. Children died of starvation in the streets, and still, Paris did not surrender. Not yet. Finally, in January 1871, the government accepted a humiliating peace. The Germans marched down the Champs-Élysées in a victory parade. It was a humiliation France would not forget. But the troubles were not over. In March 1871, the people of Paris rose up one more time. They refused to accept the peace terms. They established their own government, the Paris Commune. For 2 months, the communards controlled Paris. They enacted radical reforms, separating church and state, promoting workers' rights. They dreamed of a new kind of society based on justice. But the conservative national government would not tolerate this challenge. In May, the French army stormed Paris. What followed was known as Bloody Week. The army fought its way through the city street by street. The communards fought desperately, knowing they faced execution. They set fire to public buildings in a last gesture of defiance. The Tuileries Palace burned. The Hôtel de Ville burned. They executed hostages. When the army finally crushed the Commune, they exacted terrible revenge. Thousands of communards were executed without trial, shot against walls or in the streets where they fell. Thousands more were imprisoned or exiled. Paris was traumatized, but France endured. The late 19th century brought a new golden age, the Belle Époque, the beautiful era. It was a time of peace and prosperity. Paris became the undisputed centre of the art world. The Impressionists revolutionized painting. Monet painted his water lilies at Giverny, capturing the way light dissolved form into pure colour. Renoir painted the joy of Parisian life. Degas depicted ballet dancers with a photographer's eye for the fleeting moment. They painted light itself. But the revolution did not stop with the Impressionists. The post-Impressionists pushed further. Cézanne built his paintings with geometric forms. Van Gogh painted with violent passion, his brushstrokes like flames. And then came the explosion of the 20th century. In 1905, the Fauves shocked Paris with their wild, unnatural colours. Henri Matisse painted women with green faces and red trees. Paris at the turn of the century was a feast for the senses. Walk its streets in your mind. Gas lamps were giving way to electric lights, and the boulevards glowed at night like rivers of gold. The scent of perfume from the grand department stores mixed with the smell of fresh pastries from corner cafés. Chestnuts roasting on street corners. The river smell of the Seine. Automobiles began to replace horse-drawn carriages, their engines adding a new mechanical symphony. The metro opened in 1900, its Art Nouveau entrances designed by Hector Guimard, like the opening to underground palaces. The iron and glass curves looked like living plants. On the hill of Montmartre, artists crowded into cheap studios. The Bateau Lavoir housed Picasso in a drafty wooden room with a single skylight, Braque in a space barely larger than a closet. They lived in poverty, heating their rooms with scraps of wood, eating bread and cheese when they had money. But they worked with a sense of possibility that drew them like moths to flame. Picasso arrived from Spain in 1900, a penniless 19-year-old. He would invent Cubism, shattering the single viewpoint that had dominated Western art for 400 years. He would paint Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 5 angular prostitutes with African mask faces, a painting so radical it shocked even his fellow artists. The Moulin Rouge lit up the night, with its red windmill spinning above the entrance, its name blazing in gas lamps that could be seen across Montmartre. Inside, the can-can dancers kicked their legs to the squealing of violins and the pounding of drums, their petticoats flashing white in the smoky gaslight. Toulouse-Lautrec sat at his usual table, sketchpad in hand. Crowds, mixed aristocrats, in silk top hats, with working-class Parisians in cloth caps. It was Paris, at its most democratic and most alive. In laboratories across the city, scientists were unlocking the secrets of nature. Marie Curie, a Polish immigrant, worked in a shed with her husband Pierre, isolating radium by hand, exposing herself to radiation that would eventually kill her. She would win 2 Nobel Prizes, the first woman to win any. Louis Pasteur had peered through microscopes and discovered invisible worlds of bacteria, revolutionizing medicine. Paris was proving that human reason could illuminate the darkest mysteries, that science and art were both ways of seeing truth. But this glittering world rested on fragile foundations. Europe was a powder keg of rival alliances and arms races. In August 1914, the powder keg exploded. The First World War began. Germany invaded France through Belgium. In September 1914, the German army advanced to within 30 miles of Paris. The government prepared to evacuate. But the French army, reinforced by troops, rushed from Paris in taxicabs in one of history's most improvised operations, stopped the Germans at the Battle of the Marne. Paris was saved. For the next 4 years, France bled in the trenches. Over 1 million French soldiers died. An entire generation was lost. Paris became a city of wounded soldiers, of widows in black, of orphans. When the war finally ended in November 1918, France was victorious but devastated. The cost had been almost unbearable. The 1920s in Paris were a time of feverish creativity and hedonism. The city tried to forget the horrors of the war. Jazz music, brought by American soldiers and black musicians, became wildly popular. Josephine Baker danced at the Folies Bergère. And into this fevered atmosphere came the lost generation, young American writers. Ernest Hemingway arrived in 1921 with his first wife Hadley. They were young and poor and desperately in love with Paris. Hemingway wrote in cafés, nursing a single coffee for hours. He lived on the left bank, in a cold water flat with no bathroom. He was hungry most of the time, but he was learning his craft, finding his voice. Scott Fitzgerald came to Paris with his wife Zelda in 1925, already famous. They lived extravagantly, drinking champagne and throwing parties. But Paris was also where Fitzgerald's demons caught up with him, where Zelda's mental illness began to manifest. At the centre of it all was Gertrude Stein. Her apartment at 27 Rue de Fleurus became a legendary salon. On her walls hung paintings by Picasso, Matisse, Cézanne, works she had bought when they were still unknown. Young writers came for advice, for connections, for her famously blunt criticism. She coined the term lost generation for these young expatriates damaged by the war. But they were not just lost. In Paris they found something. The freedom to write honestly. The freedom from American prohibition to drink openly. The freedom to live and love as they chose. The cafés became their offices and living rooms. The Rotonde, the Dôme, the Select in Montparnasse. You could sit all day over a single drink. You could write, read, argue, watch the crowds pass by. But the good times could not last. The Great Depression struck in the 1930s. Unemployment soared. Political extremism grew. France was bitterly divided. Across the border, Adolf Hitler came to power. He rearmed Germany. He prepared for war. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. France and Britain declared war. But the French army was not ready for the revolutionary blitzkrieg warfare the Germans unleashed. In May 1940, German tanks smashed through the Ardennes forest and raced across France. The French army collapsed. The government fled Paris. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. For the first time since 1871, the city was occupied. The occupation would last for over 4 years. It was a dark time. The collaborationist Vichy government worked with the Nazis. French police rounded up Jews and sent them to death camps. Over 70,000 French Jews were deported. Most never returned. The resistance fought back with sabotage, but they were a small minority. Most Parisians simply tried to survive. Food was scarce, rationed, controlled. The black market thrived. German soldiers filled the cafés and boulevards. The swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. Paris, the city of light, was dimmed. Hitler himself visited Paris in June 1940. He stood on the Trocadero with the Eiffel Tower behind him. He gave an order that would haunt the city. If the Allies approached, Paris was to be destroyed. Burn it, as the Parisi had burned their village 2,000 years before. Leave nothing but ashes. General Dietrich von Choltitz was appointed the German military commander of Paris. He received Hitler's order directly. He had the explosives. Notre Dame was wired to blow. The Louvre was targeted. The bridges were ready to be destroyed. One word from von Choltitz and Paris would be rubble. But on August 25, 1944, as Allied forces approached, as the resistance rose up in the streets, von Choltitz made a choice. He did not give the order. Why? The reasons remained debated. Perhaps he could not bring himself to destroy such beauty. Perhaps he knew Germany had already lost. When asked later if he had carried out Hitler's order, he replied simply, "Is Paris burning?" It was not. Paris had survived. General Charles de Gaulle entered Paris on August 25th. He walked down the Champs-Élysées to Notre Dame. The crowd was delirious with joy. Paris was free. But de Gaulle knew something they did not yet understand. France's empire was dying. Its military power was broken. Within 2 decades, France would lose its colonies in brutal wars. It would become just another European nation, no longer a superpower. But as de Gaulle walked down that avenue, past the Arc de Triomphe that Napoleon had built, past the Place de la Concorde, where Louis XVI had been guillotined, past the Louvre, where kings had ruled, he understood something that Paris had always known. Something the Parisi had known when they chose that island. Something the medieval scholars had known when they built the Sorbonne. Something the philosophes had known when they debated in the cafés. Something the revolutionaries had known when they stormed the Bastille. Military empires rise and fall. Economic power shifts and fades. Territory changes hands. But ideas are forever. The empire Paris built was not of territory, but of thought. And it could not be conquered, because you cannot occupy an idea. You cannot bomb a philosophy. You cannot defeat a painting or imprison a song. Today, Paris's political power is modest. France is no longer a superpower, but walk through any city in the world and you will find Paris. In the café culture of Melbourne, in the fashion houses of Milan, in the revolutionary rhetoric of Caracas, in the museums of New York, in universities from Beijing to São Paulo, where students still read Voltaire and Rousseau. The Declaration of Rights, written in Paris in 1789, became the model for constitutions around the world. Its principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are now considered universal human rights. The metric system developed in revolutionary Paris became the international standard of measurement. The Impressionists who painted in Paris changed how humanity sees colour and light. The existentialists who argued in post-war Paris cafés gave us new ways to think about freedom and choice. French cuisine, refined in the kitchens of Paris, became the foundation of fine dining everywhere. Even the word restaurant itself is French, a Parisian invention. Fashion, too, bears the indelible mark of Paris. The great couturiers, from Worth to Chanel to Dior, defined elegance for over 100 years. The Parisi who first settled that muddy island could not have imagined what their city would become. They were just trying to survive, to control a river crossing, to trade and prosper. But in choosing that island, they chose something more. They chose a place where ideas would always matter more than armies, where culture would outlast conquest, where tomorrow would always be more important than yesterday. The Seine still flows through the heart of Paris, dark and eternal, carrying the reflections of monuments and bridges. The island still stands, its ancient stones bearing the weight of 2 millennia. But Paris itself, Paris is no longer just a city on a map. It is an idea that lives in the human mind. The idea that beauty matters, that art endures, that revolution is possible, that injustice can be challenged, that ideas can change the world. 2,000 years after the Parisi built their first crude bridge across the Seine, Paris still stands as a bridge, not between two banks of a river, but between who we are and who we might become, between the old world and the new, between what is and what ought to be. The city of light continues to illuminate, not with street lamps, but with the eternal fire of human imagination. The light that first flickered in a Roman bath where scholars debated, that burned brighter in a medieval university where new ideas were born. That blazed in a café where philosophes imagined a different world, that exploded in the streets during revolution, that survived occupation and emerged defiant, that still glows today in every mind touched by French thought, French art, French ideals. And so our story of Paris comes to a close. From a Celtic fishing village to the intellectual capital of the world, from refugees burning their homes to escape Rome, to revolutionaries proclaiming the rights of man, from medieval monks teaching Latin to existentialists questioning existence itself, from kings who thought they owned the city to a city that owned the very concept of revolution, from military defeat after defeat to cultural triumph that spans the globe. It has been a true pleasure to walk these streets with you, to witness these transformations, to see how ideas proved more powerful than any army ever raised. The Parisi were right. The island was worth more than any village. It was worth the future itself. Thank you for listening. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.